The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Rob Ricigliano.
Welcome to International Focus. Our topic today, political reform in Kenya. Despite a relatively peaceful transition of power to a new president, our guest today has expressed concerns about the credibility of recent elections in Kenya. What do issues at the polls tell us about the state of democratic reform in Kenya, and what is the outlook going forward? Maina Kiai is the executive director of Inform Action, a not-for-profit company that specializes in film and community discussions to demand political and social accountability in Kenya. He also currently serves as UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association. A lawyer trained in Nairobi and Harvard University, he has spent the last 20 years campaigning for human rights and constitutional reform across the world. From 2003 to 2008, he served as the chairman of Kenya's National Human Rights Commission. Maina, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you.
So the popular narrative you're walking into here, at least in the United States, is 2007, elections, 1,200 people killed. We fast forward, 2013, elections, candidates from rival ethnic groups, relatively few casualties, unqualified success, right? Or I have a feeling you're going to tell me it's a little more complicated.
Absolutely. Like everything in the world is a little bit more complex than what you see. I mean, clearly it was a peaceful election, and I think that people turned up in large numbers. They came out, and it was a good step. But remember as well, in the 2007 election, people turned up in large numbers, and it was peaceful. It was only after the announcement of the results that tensions and violence erupted. It didn't happen this time because I think there was a lot more confidence in the institutions that have been created in the new constitution, and particularly in the institution of the Supreme Court. So there was that qualitative difference that made a huge impact. And the second thing as well is that we have got devolved governments. Before 2010, Kenya had only got centralized government. The presidency was everything. We now have what we call counties, which are analogous to your states, with the governors, and that has, I think, helped to reduce the tension factors, because people feel that even if they don't win the presidency, at least they have a governor who they feel closer to, and other things. But it was a complex election, I think, and one of the reasons why I and quite a lot of us feel unhappy with it is that it was the first election under the new constitution. Kenyans spent more than 20 years fighting for a new constitution. We've spent, people died during that struggle, people were jailed, people were injured and hospitalized. There was a really consistent, long struggle of blood, sweat and tears. So we get the new constitution and our expectations rise. And so for us, the issue is, let's keep the standards as high as they are demanded by the constitution. So the election body conducts the election, and then because of the experiences of 2007, we have built in these safeguards to make sure that the integrity of the vote is maintained and the sanctity of that vote is maintained. So we have got electronic, what they call biometric voter registration. The way we vote in Kenya is that you must register as a voter, unlike perhaps in the US, where you just, as long as you're a citizen, you can vote. In Kenya, you have to register as a voter, and so that we know the baseline. We always know how many votes you are in the offing, in a sense. So we have a biometric voter register. Then we have another thing called the electronic voter identification, EVID systems. When you come to the polling station, you put your thumbprint and your picture, and everything should come out. And then we had this fascinating new gadget called results transmission system, which is an electronic system. So at the voting, once the voting is done, they're counted at the polling station, the figures are entered and sent directly to Nairobi, so that is a constant.
No one
can
gets
manipulate
to touch
it. right.
It's not paper ballots.
No, no, we vote by paper, but once they count, then it's then transmitted electronically. Right. And then it's recorded in a paper, which then also takes the route back. Now, historically in Kenya, what was counted at the polling station, that what's recorded in the paper, in the form, would change, would morph and increase. By the time it came to Nairobi, you can't recognize the figure.
So the more people that could touch it, the more
correct.
You could change it.
So the idea of this electronic system of transmission was that you have it there and you can compare the paper later. It cost about $20 to $30 million, the whole electronic system. And then they all failed. All failed. You know, so you put your thumb, there's nothing that comes in. So you have to go now to the manual one, and that's why the issue came up. So and then the electronic transmission was also seemed to have been manipulated, because it worked for about 10% of the polling stations, and we're looking at the results on a giant screen. I mean, this looked like a first world country when you're seeing the results coming in. But then you notice the top two candidates, the gap doesn't seem to change. So they would go up together, they go down together, they go up together, and you think...
It was about a 7% difference,
right? At that point. It was about 5 to 7%. Yeah. But the gap was consistent. And you think, there are 33,000 polling stations. People are coming up from different strongholds. Surely these graphs should be all over the place at some point. You don't have that. Right. So you think, there's something wrong here. That's when it stopped. So to make a long story short, once the announcement was done and we went back to the manual, and there was a lot of problems now with the tallying of the manual, the mathematical errors, we're seeing them on the screen as they're being put up. Then there was the announcement that Uhuru Kenyatta has been declared the president on the basis of the first round. And of course, they said, let's test the new Supreme Court. So we made a case to go to the Supreme Court, and the court ruled unanimously that the election was fair, free, and credible. But that has been challenged now. I mean, there's nothing you can do. Uhuru Kenyatta is now the validly elected president of Kenya. But there's a lot of questions that are going to emerge about the Election Commission and about the Supreme Court and how they made their decisions. For us, our issue now is accountability. That if we let go and say, let's just go on and leave it as that, we're going to have problems in the future. I think the Supreme Court itself made some grievous mistakes, and I wish I could share with you the judgment that they made. It was a really, really bad judgment in so many ways, full of contradictions. They basically said that what the Election Commission says about how many voters there are is the correct one. Because when we came to court, we found out about a new register called the Green Book that no one had ever heard of. Now, one of the things demanded by the Constitution is transparency in every voter, in everything around the election. So we knew about the register, which was the one that's the electronic register that you could then print out. Right. But all of a sudden, we found something else called the Green Book. Then we found out something else called the Special Register. Another one called the Unique Register. So all of a sudden, registers are coming out that we never heard of.
So Maina, what's the standard or standards we should use to think about or evaluate maybe what the state of democratic reform and rule of law is in Kenya? So at one end, it's, hey, people weren't dying by the dozens and by the hundreds. At the other end, it's, you mentioned systems and institutions, both changing and how districts and counties and provinces are organized, and the political representation, this high-tech, computer system. I mean, I mean, perfect is not probably the standard we're all asking for, but so what, help me between those two. So it's the hundreds didn't die versus perfect. What should we be looking for? What are the key things you think Kenya ought to be doing now that maybe it's not?
And this is not just about Kenya, to be honest. I think this is about the whole world. You want an election system that people have confidence in. Right. And you want a judicial system people have confidence in. The moment you lose that, then you open up other avenues that are not peaceful and are not necessarily legitimate or legal for people to raise their concerns. So it is working to get a process and systems that people say, yeah, I voted in this system, my candidate lost, and I agree because it was fair and transparent. And or we went to court, I don't agree with the judgment, but the reasons and the rationale make sense, so let's go with it. That's what you want in a society, because that's what galvanizes, that's what ensures there's peace and lack of deaths the next time round. The moment you have an election body that seems to be manipulating things and it doesn't seem to be consistent and is spending billions and billions of Kenya shillings or millions and millions of dollars, but you're not seeing the fruits of it, and you've got a court that makes a judgment, but you look at the judgment and feel there's too many inconsistencies, then you're opening the door to those deaths again. That's exactly what happened in 2007. So for us, the issue is that peace is thoroughly important, but peace is not calm. Mm-hmm. And there's a difference between calm and peace is about justice and truth. Mm-hmm. So calm can happen. I mean, right. Putin in Russia can ensure calm. Right. In Russia, or the Chinese can ensure calm in China. But peace is a different ballgame. Peace has got, on the flip side of peace is justice and truth, and people accepting that the processes are going on, whether they are with you or against you. That's what guarantees these things, and that's what Kenya has. And that's what Kenya can get. And one of the things that I'm very clear about is that Kenya's reached a point in its development, its mental and intellectual development and its social development, that people can handle these things. It's reached a level of maturity it's 50 years after independence this year. We're no longer a crawling child. We are an adult. We are 50 years old as a country. So this means we must be able to handle this. And Kenya has probably one of the best educated populations in Africa. And the highest capacity. So what we're demanding is for us to move away from where we have been, to stop doing we're expecting way more out of Kenya than we expect out of Central African Republic, sure, or out of Fiji or Papua New Guinea. This is, we don't want to be there. We want to be saying we have reached a point where we can do better. So it's that balance between justice and peace that we have to have. So
we've got just a couple minutes before we need to take a short break. How close do you think Kenya is to that line of sufficient faith and confidence in those key institutions that you talked about, sufficient feeling that enough justice has been done, that violence has been prevented, versus how close is that? If that line sinks down a little bit further, is Kenya in danger of going back, perhaps, into conflict?
Absolutely. And I think a lot will depend now how the court and the Election Commission deals with itself the next few years. How they tackle issues, whether they are seen as independent and strong, and whether they're rational. Those are important parts of it. Then I think that's what will tell us whether we're going to move. A lot, again, depends on how President Kenyatta operates as the head of state, whether he's inclusive or exclusive. The problem in the last time was a sense by more than half the country that they were excluded from governance. And that made a hell of a difference. And the question is now whether Kenyatta will continue in that sense or not. It's not just about economic growth and economic development. It's also a sense of inclusion. Mm-hmm. One of the things we haven't done in Kenya for 50 years is build a sense of nationhood. We come from different ethnic groups, and that's what we know to a very large extent. And consecutive presidents in Kenya have elevated their particular ethnic group at the top. So we've had most people feeling excluded from it. So it's not that hard, to be honest, to build a sense of inclusion and a sense of nationhood. But I think it's got to be a conscious approach by the presidency and by the people around him and by the courts as well, to make people feel, look, you have a fair chance at these. When you make a complaint, you have a fair chance. Yeah. When you go into elections, you have a fair chance. If people don't have that, then they resort to other things. So that's what I would say. So it really will depend the next few years. But the challenge is quite high on the court, especially to guarantee us that it's going to be independent.
So we have to take a break, but I want to come back maybe and talk about what more needs to be done or could be done kind of going forward to ensure the gains in Kenya become more permanent. So Maina Kiai will be back in just a minute here on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking about political and democratic reform in Kenya with Maina Kiai of Inform Action in Kenya, as well as with the UN. Maina, I want to talk about what can be done on the ground from the perspective of human rights activists and from others in Kenya to kind of to strengthen this transition, to not rest on the laurels of an election, but to move forward. Before we get there, I want to put us in a bigger context here, which is the role of the international community and Kenya's place both in Africa and in that broader international community. And I've heard you speak to this point in the past about the West certainly wants a success story in Africa, especially after Mali, which had been a leading, example of a success story, is completely sort of fallen apart. What's the pressure from the international side for the Kenyans? We don't care about the details. Just don't make bad news.
Well, Kenya is in a particularly unique place within Africa and within particularly the eastern and Horn of Africa. There's the Al-Shabaab that's in Somalia. There's the collapsed state of Somalia that's begun to rebuild now. There's Ethiopia that's got its own issues around human rights violations. It's a very stable state, but a lot of tensions within the state about legitimacy. You've got Uganda that's had a president since 1986 and who seems to want to replace himself with his son. You've got Rwanda, not very far off, they've got a government that's got issues now with Congo and other things. So that region has become a region now of worry. Mm-hmm. It was highlighted, particularly during the Clinton administration, as one of the more prospective regions. Kenya serves a particularly important role. The United Nations is headquartered in Kenya. A big part of it is headquartered in Kenya. There's a lot of trade going through. There's a lot of humanitarian assistance. There's a diplomatic and economic hub of that sub-region. There is a significant role for the international community. One of them they've played well, I must say, that because during the elections, one of the most difficult things was accessing the local media and highlighting some of the issues that were going wrong. The local media made a decision together with the Election Commission and the government that they would not allow any criticism of the election body to come out. So there was a blanket ban, in a sense, of any critical issues. So the international...
That's not necessarily a good thing.
Sorry, I think it's a horrible thing to do. I think it's a horrible thing to do. I think it's also very insulting, because the assumption is that if they show the negative side, then it means that Kenyans will erupt. It's really treating us like as though we're kids. So the international media played a big role there, because now they opened up their channels so you could actually talk to international media. Once it's out internationally, then it will come back at the national level. So there are things to be done at that point in terms of keeping focus on Kenya. I think it's critical that the international community does not let go of Kenya. I think Kenya can succeed. I mean, that's one of the fascinating things about Kenya, is that its potential to succeed is very high. Its potential to go backwards is also very high. So you've got to put the right mix of attention and pressure and carrots as well to move it. One of the fundamental things, of course, now is the International Criminal Court, and the fact that our president and deputy president are indictees of the International Criminal Court, and from at the end of May and then the beginning of July, they will both be going. They're supposed to be going to The Hague to face charges and face the trial starts. This is a first I think it's never happened before in the world, where a sitting president is facing accusations of crimes against humanity, and a sitting deputy president is facing accusations. How that plays out is going to be crucial to where Kenya goes and how it goes. They've both said they're going to continue with their cases. But they've also now said that they also don't want to go. They want to do it by video conferencing or send their lawyers. The rules of the International Criminal Court are very clear. You have to attend in person. It's not a right, it's an obligation. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Of course, it's hard when you have a case that runs consistently for months and months to be running back to Kenya over the weekend to run the country and then dash back on Monday to go and face your case. There's going to be an interesting scenario, and what we're hoping for is that the international community maintains the same consistent standards with respect to international justice as it has done. Please don't make any exemptions for Kenya because it's Kenya. Please keep it there. And we're beginning to worry, because we're seeing signs from some certain countries of beginning to backslide, right, because it's Kenya and because of the vast economic interests there. So we've got to keep that the same standards has got to be kept. If the international community sends a signal that they can bend the rules whenever they feel like, because this is difficult, it's going to make things very difficult. Yes, of course, justice doesn't exist in a vacuum, but once we apply justice, and we have got to act as though it's in a vacuum, and you've got to act on those principles of justice as they are. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic that happens. We don't know what's going to happen, but if they don't go, if they then decide they're not going to The Hague, then there's a possibility of being like Sudan occurs, and with El-Bashir, who's refused to attend.
Also indictee.
Indictee of the International Criminal Court. That becomes a different thing altogether, and that's going to be interesting to see how the international community works and thinks through it. But even for us at the local level, the domestic level, we've got to think through what it means, because refusal, not what they call non-cooperation with the International Criminal Court, has to have a political dynamic and a political consequence.
Well, you're just saying accountability being one of these
internally
very important issues.
Absolutely.
Now you have there's an international component to
Absolutely.
that.
So we know it's an issue that is of concern for us, because if they decide they're not going to go and they don't cooperate with the International Criminal Court, there is absolutely no way you can have trials in Kenya of these guys. So those of us who are seen as supporters of international criminal justice will have to be watching our backs quite consistently and quite carefully, because there's a logic to it. Because even up to now, even at this point, there are these stories and rumors going along that it was the local human rights community that sent them to The Hague. And I ask why. They say because you did investigations into the violence. So I asked them, are you suggesting we shouldn't have done investigations? Right. Say yes, just leave it and we move on. I say, but thousands of people died. Thousands have died and people are displaced. So it's one of those contradictions that are there. But it's going to be an interesting time. I mean, on the other hand, though, I think Kenyatta has issued some public statements that are not bad. I mean, the rhetoric hasn't been bad, especially when he opened Parliament, talked about rights and freedoms, and he talked about anti-corruption. But whether he'll keep that in the light of facing continuous charges at the International Criminal Court is going to be a big issue.
Now, you talked before about this balance between calm and justice, and making the distinction between calm is not peace, right? What do you need to be doing within Kenya, you and your colleagues and civil society, to help make sure that, maybe we made some sacrifices on the justice front to get calm through the election, but what are the big issues you've got to be dealing with going forward?
Well, I think the biggest issue for us, that confronts Kenya and again many other African countries, is the identity question. That we make political decisions very, very strongly on the basis of our identity, my community, because we don't have a common Kenyan identity. We have an ethnic identity. So when a person comes out as a leader of that community, then the entire community goes for it and feels they circle the wagons, if you wish, and feel this is the person, we'll live with it. We've got to figure out a way in which we break this barrier a little bit. Your identity is part of you. There's no doubt about that. But it shouldn't be everything, and it shouldn't be the end all and the be all. You also have other identities as a farmer, as a professional, as a whatever it is. And how do we elevate those identities as well, so you can be able to think about it? But the work we have to do clearly is first of all, at the grassroots level. One of the weaknesses, if you wish, of Kenyan pro-democracy activists have been the fact we don't spend enough time on the ground. We are very much elite. We are very much in Nairobi, very much doing media work. We're doing lobbying at the parliament. We're doing workshops and moving that discussion. Our political class is extremely effective and clever at getting down to the grassroots and working with people on a very regular basis. We've got to do that as well. We don't have the same structures of unions which are strong and you can work with them, or with community organizations that you can grow with and be able to move, or movements like the women's movement. And those are things we have to start creating and working with, that we can be able to put an ideological agenda of sorts, whatever it is. Doesn't matter whether it's a conservative agenda or a progressive agenda, but I hope it's a progressive agenda. But you can push that on, then we'll be able to probably mitigate some of the worst excesses that could happen. But it's a consistent struggle, and it's a consistent, I think, for us, a task for us to keep going down to the local level and interacting and discussing and conversing with people. It's never easy. Sometimes it's very uncomfortable, but it's got to be done. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we've got, and that's a place that the international community can play a role, because we're not reinventing the wheel. I mean, Brazil has been able to do fantastic work at that. India's got some fantastic lessons about how to do it. Tunisia and Egypt, in terms of how they built their own movements for change. There's so many lessons you can borrow from across the world in many places. And in fact, even the United States has got its own experiences that can be drawn from in terms of how you move it. So there's a lot of work in that sense for us, yeah.
So you mentioned the U.S. We unfortunately only have about less than a couple minutes left. I'm wondering, I'm reflecting as you're talking about how in the U.S., we've former presidential candidate John Edwards talked about two Americas. We're seeing these we're seeing more polarized identities now. And I wonder if any reflections you have for us here in the United States, where we seem to be going the opposite way from what Kenya is trying to do in terms of building this common national identity.
Well, I'm not sure we are even moving in Kenya to build it. I think mine is an aspiration. I wish we would be able to find a way to create a national identity the way, because I think Americans have a national identity in the sense that Americans feel American either from their history, from the crossing over and coming into America, the entire slave trade and slavery. There's a history that binds America together. Now the immigration's coming from South as well. So there's a lot of history. But what is interesting in America is that divisions are happening, and in a sense between conservatives now and progressives, and it's not even class so much. It's almost ideological. It's very ideological. Some people want a very conservative society where they don't want they want to minimize the role of the state. Others think the state has a bigger role to play. I think that's a healthy division, and as long as it's not violent, right. It's a healthy division. If people can engage on it on the issues and have it. I think it's a good one.
I'll remember that it's healthy next time I read the newspaper and I hear one of these debates. Maina Kiai, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on Kenya and democratic reform, and to our viewers, we'll see you next week on International Focus. Thanks.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,